Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for May 14th, 2021. I'm going to begin with a couple of news stories and then get into the questions, as today is a Friday. Let's start with some developments around the US and Russia. It's been announced now that Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, will meet with Tony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, in Reykjavik, Iceland on May 20th. The discussions will include setting up the Putin-Biden summit. It was also announced that the focus will be on strategic stability, which probably means the talk about a new START agreement. Also restoring the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the so-called Iran agreement, and also approaches to the Korean nuclear arms question, the issue that continues with North Korea. Now, in making this announcement, Blinken couldn't help but throw in a statement on the talks that his purpose is, quote, to respond to actions by Russia that harm us or our allies. A little bit of unnecessary continued brinksmanship. But we're hearing more voices for sanity coming out in the face of the war talk. One is Oliver Stone, the distinguished film producer and director, who said the U.S. must change its point of view of seeking to be the only power in the world. It's a suicidal path, Stone said. Also from former U.S. Ambassador to China and former Washington State Governor Gary Locke, he said, we must strive to find common ground to work together with China because we face so many issues which cannot be solved by the U.S. or by China alone. Let's hope there can be more of these voices come out, and it's really important for our viewers to make known that the idea of diplomacy rather than saber rattling is the way to get beyond the danger of war, which otherwise is an omnipresent danger at the moment. Now, secondly, just some news on the Great Reset and the Green New Deal. CNBC television acknowledged that the Federal Reserve is, quote, following in the footsteps of the Bank of England, who are more aggressively integrating climate change risks into the regulatory framework, unquote. In other words, cutting credit for physical production, for so-called commitment to the zero carbon-based policy, and pursuing the Green New Deal in its lending policies, which means building a new green bubble. In its own comment on this, Reuters wrote that, quote, climate change could upend the financial system, unquote, saying that the Fed is moving to wipe out trillions of dollars of investments in fossil fuels and industrial and agricultural production to create a new green bubble. This is, of course, what we've said from the beginning. And the idea of the Great Reset and the Green New Deal are two sides of the same coin, and are intended to reduce the capability of mankind to produce the quality and quantity of goods necessary to sustain life for 7.5 billion people on the planet. We have put out a report on this, The Great Leap Backward, and if you haven't gotten it yet, you should order it and read it and circulate it, because this is the way we're going to defeat the insane strategy using climate change, just as they were using the lockdowns over COVID, to introduce the austerity policies that the bankers need and are demanding. So let's get to the questions now. First, someone asked about the push to impose critical race theory and the 1619 story in U.S. education, which essentially says that the U.S. was built as a slave economy from the very beginning, completely negating the reality that it was Alexander Hamilton's intervention with his national bank policy, his tariff policy, and his credit policy that built the country. Instead, the argument is that it was built on slave labor, and that this is why there's systemic racism in the United States. So the question is, who's organizing this and why? Well, I think you know the answer to that. It all comes from the British. It was the British that introduced the slave trade, excuse me, along with the Spanish, into the colonies. It was the British who then organized, after losing the American Revolution, have been organizing to destroy the concept of Hamiltonian economics, who are committed instead to a globalist free trade model, which does not allow for the advances in physical production that are needed to sustain the world's population. And it's the British that are using such things as critical race theory and identity politics to destroy the sovereign nation state, to attack the idea that any nation should have a mission to defend the sovereign advance of its people, and instead should be focused on destroying those aspects of physical economy which allow for a nation to advance and increase its productivity. This has been an ongoing battle throughout American history. So it should not be surprising that it's emerging today as one of the theories of choice to use the education system to destroy this question of what was unique about the American system. This is not the kind of American exceptionalism that's promoted by the so-called American firsters, but is based on the concept of the Founding Fathers of the necessity for national sovereignty over such important things as credit policy and patent policy and the ability of a nation to direct its energies into future areas of science and technology. So that's what the fight is all about. The British Empire, and by that I mean the City of London and its allied banks on Wall Street, Brussels, Frankfurt, and so on, their intent to shut down a reaction against the Great Reset by using racial tensions, ethnic tensions, identity issues to prevent the organization of the US and other nations around these principles of national sovereignty and physical productivity. So that's what it is, and it's not surprising that it was in the New York Times, which has been a publication of the British Empire for most of its history. The second question was on the emergence of the rules-based order as the dominant theme of U.S. policy against Russia and China. And the question is this just the reemergence of the British Empire? And how can we show this to people? Well, one of the ways you can identify it is to take the speech given by Professor Kirchler, a retired professor from Vienna, who spoke at the Schiller Institute conference on May 8th and defined the difference between the so-called rules-based order, which is based on arbitrary rules designed to promote a unipolar system in which military muscle, sanctions, and the like are employed against any nation which refuses to submit to the demands of the City of London and Wall Street. That's what the rules-based order is. It's a unipolar world, which was first put forward after the fall of the Soviet Union by the Project for a New American Century, which asserted that the defeat of communism was the triumph of free enterprise and free market policies, and therefore the United States had the responsibility to impose that so-called democratic system on any nation which would put the interests of its population ahead of those of the international financial regime. That's all the rules-based order is. It's a complete rejection of principles of international law, which began to be asserted in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia, and continued to define the best attempts by nations to establish an order based on international law, including the establishment of the United Nations. With all the problems of the UN Charter does include within it the principle of sovereignty and the opposition to intervention in the affairs of other nations. That's international law, whereas the rules-based order, as cooked up by Tony Blair and such followers of his as Susan Rice and Samantha Power, the rules-based order gives the right for regime change using the military might of the United States and to some extent NATO to impose the will of the bankers, of the global central bankers, on any nation which steps out of line. And what does it mean to step out of line? To reject the idea of a zero carbon-based economy and instead commit itself to economic development for the benefit of its population today and in the future. So the rules-based order is essentially an imperial doctrine that, as I mentioned, Blair was one of the first in the recent period to push it most aggressively, beginning in 1999. But it has become the mantra of the transatlantic would-be autocrats to attack any nation which wishes to develop. As we've been pointing out, the best way to defeat this would be an alliance among sovereign states, including the United States, working together with Russia, China, and India, which was LaRouche's initial idea of a four-power agreement, to overcome the power of the bankers and their use of U.S. military force to impose a Pax Americana. So yes, it is a reemergence of the British Empire in a perhaps modern form, but just as deadly to the issue of freedom of nations and freedom of people to develop their creative potentials for the good of all mankind. Now, the final question I'll take today is, given the escalating danger of an all-out war in the Middle East, which we're seeing in terms of the fighting between Israel and Palestine, but also is implicit in the sanctions regime against Syria, the continued Saudi war against the people of Yemen, the attacks on Iran, and so on. Is there a way to resolve the differences between Iran and Israel? Well, as Mrs. LaRouche always emphasizes, these questions can't be removed from the bigger picture. Why are there differences between Iran and Israel, or between Saudi Arabia and Iran, or between any of the countries in the Middle East that are engaged in these little battles which could explode into a full-scale war in Southwest Asia? This is not based on serving the interests of the people of these countries, just as moving Jewish settlers into territory occupied by Palestinians is not a solution for the people of Israel, no matter how much that maniac Benjamin Netanyahu asserts that it is. Instead, it's a continuation of geopolitics, which classically were introduced into the Middle East in the period before World War I, based on Lloyd George and his British Israelite faction in the leadership of the British Empire, which essentially asserted the British right to intervene to protect its dominance in world trade and finance. And over the period between the 1890s up until the Versailles Agreement in 1918 and afterwards, the nations of the Middle East were carved up in such a way as to assure there could not be solid, self-sustaining nation states, but you would have ethnic enclaves, religious enclaves, tribal groupings that would be vying for power, that would be fighting in such a way as to invite intervention by outside forces, which in 1918 meant the British, but increasingly after World War II included the Americans. So what's the problem between Israel and Iran? Well, the line that Iran is out to destroy Israel has to be seen as a defensive position because Iran has been under attack going back to the 1907 agreement between Russia and Britain to carve it up, to carve up Persia into a British zone, a Russian zone, and a neutral zone. When the Iranians after World War II began to assert national independence with the government of Mossadegh, it was overthrown by the CIA using a British game plan. And when the Shah was moving toward an industrial revolution in the 70s, the British threw their weight behind the extremist Islamic fundamentalist Khomeini to overturn the Shah and to create a regime in Iran which was hostile toward the existence of Israel. But then again, what has been the Israeli posture in the region? It's been the assertion in the recent years of a greater Israel, which to some among Netanyahu's followers, among the most radical settlers, includes all the land between the Tigris and Euphrates and the Nile. That's the vision of Vladimir Jabotinsky, who David Ben-Gurion called Vladimir Hitler, who asserted an Israeli race theory that said that all that land was given to the Jews by God, and that therefore it's up to the Jewish settlers to seize it. Of course, that was done as a British intervention at the end of World War II to establish the State of Israel. So if you wish to address these problems, you can have ceasefires, you can have outside forces moving in to enforce those ceasefires, but what's really needed is economic development of nations with the absence of geopolitical intervention. That's the only way for a lasting peace, as Lyndon LaRouche developed in his program on the Oasis Plan for Israel and in his visit to Iraq in 1975. So short of that, we're going to have continued hotspots that can be blown up at the drop of a hat. So those are the questions that took for today. I'll see you again next week, and if you haven't done so yet, go to theschillerinstitute.com to look at the conference that we held on May 8th, which took up these questions in the broadest form. Thanks, and I'll see you on Monday.